The National Trust has more than 4 million members. It's Britain's largest landowner, as English as cream teas. Or is it? Because it all began in Wales, where it continues to look after the treasures of this beautiful country. But I want to find out what the future holds for this guardian of our shared past.
Gorgeous, isn't it? That's prime Welsh countryside behind me. But it's also, in a fundamental way, a sort of museum of our own history. A living, working museum.
The National Trust has taken on the role of curator of that museum for the 231 tenanted farms it owns here in Wales. What does it take to be one of their farmers?
I couldn't just pop up as an ex-comedian and say, I've decided I want to look after a farm.
How do they cope with all those redundant farm buildings?
Can't cost a lot to restore, can it?
And how do they encourage nature, provide access, and help this living museum to pay its way?
What sort of landlord does it want to be? The National Trust owns farmland all over Wales, but it owns a slightly disproportionate amount in high uplands, in Snowdonia, places like that, because it's beautiful and romantic land. It was as a result of owning coastland and buying up coastland that it started to acquire a slightly wider portfolio of types of farms. And it's now become of interest to it to expand that portfolio and cover more of the history of farming in Wales.
One of the places where the Trust is addressing that history is here, in Treleddyd Fawr, close to St David's in North Pembrokeshire. I've come to see the Trust's latest bequest. It was left to them on the death of its owner, Mr Griffiths. They've accepted it, which, according to the Trust Director, Justin Albert, is unusual.
I get offered a lot of properties on an almost weekly basis. And people presume and think you're of a National Trust, you can take things on. We can't. As a charity, we can't take on things that will be a financial drain unless it is of such cultural importance and so at risk, and nobody else can take it on. We will then have to take it on.
So, what is so special about this little farm worker's cottage?
Less than 100 years ago, cottages like this littered the Welsh landscape, almost literally, because over here there was a sort of system of dispersed villages with labourers living in little cottages out in the fields. But it's extraordinary how much of that's been swept away. Farming is now done by far fewer people. As a result, many fell into ruin. The rest, well, they were either turned into holiday cottages or they were converted. And we can't exactly blame people because this is a very wet and windy area. You need a sealed roof. You need windows that are shut. You want a proper central heating system, bathroom, and all those things change cottages completely. As a result, this simple place is very rare.
Mr Griffiths, who used to live here, he was bathing in a tin bath in front of the fire up until the day he left.
Nathan Goss, the National Trust's building consultant, is showing me around.
Porch is fantastic. It's one piece of slate up on the top here. Absolutely love that detail.
I'd love to see a man, you see, in love with things which other people might not even notice. Yeah. This is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. So anybody else might come here and go, oh, well, it's all right, interesting, but this to you is something that you just don't see anymore.
I believe that this is the only traditional tithan, small homestead, left in northern Pembrokeshire untouched.
Nathan, it's clear to see, loves it. Every bit of it.
I believe it needs to be a holiday cottage and it needs to be an experience.
And if Nathan gets his way, it'll certainly be a hell of an experience.
And that is the only bit of modern plumbing in the entire place.
Yes, that's everything there.
Really?
This is the bathroom.
Nothing inside at all?
No, nothing at all.
Okay. And you're going to preserve that?
I'd like to, yes.
Would you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You'd like people to come here and stay in this cottage and have to go out in the middle of the night to use it?
100%.
In your dreams.
This is my favourite window in the whole cottage. I challenge you to walk past this and not smile. Perfectly proportioned window.
OK, let's have a look at the roof here, Nathan. Tell me about this roof.
The top section of the roof, as you can see, is the traditional Pembrokeshire roof. It's slate with lime slurry poured over the top.
OK, now that's called a grouted
A grouted roof. Yeah.
And why did they pour the lime over the slate?
Pembrokeshire slate is traditionally poor. It'll last about 10 years. You might be lucky if you get 20 out of it. So they came up with a mix and they could pour straight over the top and put on the brush. And it was just broom, you know, once a year, get up on the top of the roof, tie yourself to the chimney, and away to go.
This is a tradition unique to this part of the world, and the roof is one of the reasons the Trust has agreed to take it on.
Your ideal will be to save as much of this bodge as possible.
The back section we might. Front section, I'm saying no, but I can only say from what I've seen from the outside.
So you have to hold up the whole building at the moment?
Yeah, the whole building is extremely dangerous at the moment. The weight of the roof is coming straight down.
It's Welsh wallpaper mania in here.
I think there's 26 layers on above that fireplace there.
Look at that. One of the things that you find about Welsh cottages is that people loved their wallpaper and they just kept putting more layers. Those are beautiful, beautiful, going back in time. Got to be careful. Got to preserve that and keep that. Now look what I've done.
Note to self, hands in pockets during site visits. There are some significant features here, unique to a farm labourer's cottage.
It's not even a cut beam, just a piece of branch to hold up the fireplace.
One of the traditional features is this internal porch that stops the draught from the front door.
This is a particular detail which you don't find in many buildings anymore, this partition.
And other, more everyday details.
You missed one fantastic detail, which is this wonderful cobweb.
I saw the cobweb.
Yeah, that's
You're not going to keep the cobweb?
well, we could try.
But in the end, you have to ask, what exactly are we saving here?
I mean, I know we love it, but there's going to be an army of experts involved coming in to discuss it. I mean, 2 up, 2 down. There's going to be a legion of expert conservators coming. This isn't built by any Go Jones. No architect was involved here. This isn't a great sort of 17th century mansion that reflects the political history of our country. Why this place?
I think that this place is probably more important than a 17th century mansion to me and to the people in Pembrokeshire and to other architects. It is the Brad Pitt of cottages. It's the most photographed, filmed, drawn cottage in the whole of Pembrokeshire, probably in the whole of Wales. If we lose this now, then you've lost a whole section of history.
There are a number of conditions which any property that the National Trust takes on has to fulfil. It has to be aesthetically interesting in some way. It has to be rather beautiful. I think this place is. It has to have a conservation angle to it. It has to be, say, because it's the last of its type or it's in danger of being lost forever, and that's true about this place. And perhaps most important of all, but sometimes the most difficult to fulfill, it has to find a way of paying for itself in the future. Now here, that's quite difficult because there's only an acre of land and that's hardly a rich endowment.
The Trust can't make money by farming here, nor can they charge at the door like they do for, say, Powys Castle. The only option is really to rent it to people looking for an authentic 18th century experience.
Well, it's not a big place, which in one regard is the entire point. But it's not entirely in great nick. Still, small, can't cost a lot to restore, can it? I've restored a cottage myself, and because we were on telly, I absolutely wanted to do it right. And I think it's probably the most expensive thing I've ever done, because there are so many different ways of doing things and so many levels of heritage conservation that you could go to.
A fair criticism is that we would do something to such a degree of perfection that it became unsustainable for anyone else other than a reasonable spendthrift charity. So no, I think that we will not do that at Treleddyd Fawr. I think we will use traditional craft skills and we'll make it wonderful, but we're not going to turn it into some kind of pit to which we can throw money in to get the perfect join here. I mean, I don't see it as my duty to do that, to give no one can see it. Sorry, I don't. Boy, my conservatives are going to kill me for saying this, but they're still wrong.
However the details of restoration are settled in the future, the big picture is that this acquisition shows a new way of thinking.
It's interesting from the point of view of the National Trust because buying this is part of a slightly different policy in relation to farms and the countryside. A lot of the land that they own is in the north of Wales and in romantic landscape which intellectuals associated with the sublime and the glorious, and hence you have hill farms and bits of Snowdonia and mountains. But there's not much that tells the other story of agriculture, the hard toil, the small holding, and that's why this place is important.
Changes in priorities are affecting the way the Trust manages the land, as well as the buildings they own.
One of the things that's rather interesting about the National Trust is that it is a form of autocracy. Essentially, somebody needs to be there setting standards and saying, this is exactly what will happen.
To understand more about setting those standards, I've come to Treleddyd Farm in South Pembrokeshire. Jonathan Hughes is the Trust's land manager here.
Would you tell me what to do?
No, we wouldn't tell you what to do. We would agree broad parameters right at the outset, and we would say, these are the type of things we're looking for from this particular farm.
What ones have you had where you go, that's a good idea, let's do that?
No, I mean, one of them would be around public access and enjoyment. So if you can accommodate people coming there, whether it's for education groups or people camping or something like that, I think we'd be very open to ideas which introduce people into the landscape. I think we'd be very interested in broadening biodiversity, so widening hedge banks, creating ponds, that type of thing.
Right.
If there were areas that would traditionally have been wet but have been drained in the last 50 years, and you could allow those to become wetter and broaden the range of flowers and insects that would grow there, we would be very supportive of that.
Here at Treleddyd, they farm 600 acres. And at first glance, it looks like any other farm. But it's a trust tenancy, and things are never that simple. Appearances can be deceptive.
About 2 weeks ago, my son came in laughing, and he said to me, Mum, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but there's a lady outside who's just asked if she could use the bathroom. So I've just showed her into the house. And I just wish I'd been quicker to sort of ask her if she was a member as she left, because she'd seen the National Trust sign at the entrance and decided that as a National Trust member, she could come into our home and use the facilities.
This misconception might be caused by the fact that most people don't realise that the Trust runs working farms. There are three main reasons why it owns agricultural land. Firstly, as part of the endowment on a stately home. Secondly, in areas where they need to preserve a traditional way of life. And thirdly,
This farm here arrived with the National Trust almost by default. They were after the coastline and they got the farm to go with it. So they then had to face the question, what do they do with it? How are they going to farm it?
in order to answer this, we need to understand a little about the recent history of farming.
Most commercial farmers today have been educated into the post-war consensus, which sees extra productivity, trying to get the most out of their land as the highest priority, as almost a sacred duty. But the National Trust doesn't quite see it that way. It has other concerns. They might include tradition, biodiversity, or even the look of the landscape. And that can be confusing to a farmer who just wants to earn an honest bob.
My father-in-law and father-mother-in-law came here in 1968 on the back of the sort of dig for victory type ticket, if you like. They were into producing as much food as effectively as they possibly could. They drained land, they limed land, they improved the land, and I say improved in so much as for production, they improved it.
Today it has sheep, it has cattle, it has potatoes, and a new set of priorities.
We've now moved into sort of balancing up to where we farm the land, and that land which is most productive, we throw a lot of inputs in, fertiliser sprays, pesticides. But there are other parts of our land that aren't quite so productive, and those are the parts of land that we've identified and said that, well, actually, you know, maybe there isn't much point in throwing all these high-value inputs. There's only a finite amount of these resources. Isn't it better to concentrate those resources onto the more productive land?
Intensive farming is right in some places. It's not right everywhere, particularly because it's not sustainable. If you intensively farm and you do not leave wildlife corridors, you will lose that land eventually. That land ceases to be productive. Your rivers will die. The runoff will kill the rivers, it'll kill the fish. It is not a sensible way to perpetuate our environment.
Recently, this has become the Trust's mantra. It believes that if you only farm intensively, too many species will die out, and eventually the land will become barren. So the Smithies were encouraged to try a different approach with several of their coastal fields.
I think it was probably quite hard for Dad at one stage, definitely, and he took a while to get his head around the fact that all that work, all that effort, all the drainage that he'd put in was being ripped out.
You know, when you see diggers in there and bulldozers in there and pushing soil around like that, it is quite an emotive thing.
I think he sort of reaps the rewards now, and he started the environmental works with the one field Hofflands that he put into an environmental scheme in the mid-1980s.
What the Trust and the Smithies wanted to know is what would happen if the land was returned to what it was like before intensive farming and fertilisation. In order to measure this, they treated the three sets of fields differently, each one having the soil nutrients removed. What are the results so far?
I mean, the one thing that was very quickly was different was the birds. There's been a huge increase of skylarks and choughs. The ones that were left without any treatment at all just basically grew grass because there was a grass there anyway, and it's just grown and it's outcompeted everything else. The soil scraping and the light acidification with a light dose of sulphur are really the ones I'll take you to see. You know, they're the ones that look good. They got heather, and all sorts of other things, which the botanist can tell you all about. But the ones that are maybe as interesting as those are the ones that have got the high levels of sulphur that really we don't quite know where they're going. You know, this is a really long-term project. This isn't just sort of 10 years. This is sort of 50 years down the line.
But there are other sides to National Trust involvement too.
There's quite a complicated relationship going on here because Peter and Gina pay the National Trust a fee in order to use their logo to advertise their potatoes.
We have to comply with quite a lot of quite stiff regulation as to the production of the potatoes and all the crops and all the animal welfare within the farm.
It's been worth it for us. It gives us a market. The potato trade is notoriously fickle. You can lose quite a lot of money very quickly.
People who belong to the National Trust or aspire to belong to the National Trust trust the brand.
And we're not at the whim of a merchant that says, well, actually, today I'll give you £80 a tonne, tomorrow I'll give you 75, and the next day I'll give you 70, and etc., etc.
So, Peter and Gina pay a fee, and that helps to guarantee an income. The trust gets its rent and the fee, and the customer is buying into a brand or known package, which includes a level of environmental concern.
I think as time goes on, we're going to have an increasing pressure on balancing people paying for good conservation as to people paying for amount of food. And over the next 10 or 20 years, that balance is going to change as to more money going towards good conservation. And I think one of the jobs of the Trust is to work with our tenants and work with other farmers to help that transition.
They're not particularly, as such, interested in the value, pound, shillings and pence value of the land. They're more interested in the value as in enjoyment and environmental enhancement. And although they want the rent paid, and so we've got to produce some things, you know, they are considerate in how we negotiate rentals, I suppose.
At Trehill, the Smithies and the Trust have found a way to set aside marginal land to nature, while still making an income from farming the other fields. But there are other farms where making money in the modern age is a much more difficult prospect. And the Trust's intentions here are different. Like Llyndy Isaf, a 600-acre farm on the side of Snowdon.
What will you try to do there?
Treleddyd Fawr is a kind of unique place. The farmer who had it beforehand for 40 years maintained an extraordinarily environmentally sensitive, way before it was trendy to do. And he grazed it with natural cattle, he got rid of the rhododendrons that were invasive. And we're going to keep on going with that.
The Trust are also investing in young farmers and shepherds so they can learn the traditional skills needed to farm this managed wilderness. We joined Justin on a site visit with Arwyn Owen, the local farm manager.
There's 2 full-time shepherds, and then Bryn is here.
Yep.
Permanently, actually. Bryn is out on the hills permanently now.
Such investment costs money. And if you can't charge at the door, as it were, how do you balance the books? Well, the Trust are capitalising on Snowdonia's unique environment.
At high season, we're taking, what, 6% out of the stream?
The hydroelectric turbine on this farm uses the high rainfall here to generate enough electricity to power over 400 homes.
I hope we can cover some of our costs, if not most of our costs, but farming on the side of Snowdon is not, I would say, one of the greatest investments you can make, but it's important for the Trust because we have these 3, the conservation, the finance and the social ambition to do it.
The Trust's social ambition takes many new forms, but it also includes the oldest ideal of the National Trust, part of its founding ethos: access.
I'm moving on now to visit another farm. Only this is one where they've taken on one of the principles of National Trust ownership to such a degree that they've become farmers who don't really farm anymore.
I'm at Pwllcarrog, a trust farm in the southwest of Pembrokeshire, just down the road from St David's.
It still looks like a working farm from the outside until you open that door, and then you go inside and it's a completely different use to the buildings to what you'd expect.
With the Trust's approval, Ian Griffiths and his late wife Judy started a bed and breakfast at their 250-acre farm to supplement their farming income.
The late 90s was particularly tough, with cereal prices were exceptionally low, and we were very much under the cosh as farmers.
The Trust helped Ian develop a business plan that would give him an income while fulfilling one of the Trust's main interests, giving access to the land.
We decided to sell the beef herd, sell the machinery and the tractors and equipment, and reinvest that into toilets and showers and kitchens and dining halls and more bunk beds.
Ian rents the land he doesn't use to neighbouring farmers.
So all these sheds were turned into places for people to punk down, 300 at a time. And they do come, they have a look round the farm, they may even dig a few spuds and go for a walk along the coastal path. And this is not only a form of diversification for the farmer, getting him a bit of income from a different source, it's also an embodiment of the philosophy of the Trust. It allows access for people.
The Trust has embraced this in their Things to Do Before You're 11 3/4 initiative. Children are encouraged in activities in the outdoors, like making a raft or playing games.
This one child was gazing out to sea. He said, well, what's that out there? And we said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, is that fire out on the horizon? And he said, no, that's the sunset. To engage children with the countryside and with the sea and everything is quite rewarding. You feel valued again as a farmer.
The National Trust is a huge landlord. It looks after a lot of property. And as a result, as well as just managing that property, clearly it has a series of responsibilities. It wants to show that it's doing the right thing.
It has to help its tenant farmers to make a living while being mindful of the costs of intensive farming. It has to decide where to invest in sensitive restoration of historic buildings and in new green technology. But it also has to encourage maximum access.
Is there conflict within your own organisation about what example you should make?
I think there was a greater divergence 10, 20 years ago in the Trust between those who loved buildings and concrete and masonry and Baroque furniture, and those who liked getting naked and running and jumping into fields and celebrating Mother Earth. And there were two pools on the National Trust for a long time. The Trust has come together, and that difference between the people who wear sandals and brogues is less obvious now.
Whatever your shoe of choice, it's clear that the Trust is increasingly following a path back to traditional farming methods.
Originally, the National Trust was founded to take into care places of either great historical interest or great natural beauty. But today, we're increasingly learning that you can't have one without the other. That farmland, like this, has its great natural beauty only if you take account of its history.